So it's on, and yeah, people are coming in. Great. Okay, I'm gonna try to align on my windows.
I know.
I'm actually really glad we do these together, because if I had to look at the chat and the Q&A and the slides and talk, I wouldn't be able to do it all.
I still feel like I don't do a great job of multitasking during the chat, during the presentation, but it's okay.
Folks say, y'all have been doing great. Thank you.
I wish everyone could see my desk, which is covered in like bandalooms, and my younger daughter found the glitter, which should be like a controlled substance. And here's the measuring spoon she took to measure the glitter before she dumped it on my desk. There's Hatchimals over there. I don't know. It's a bad scene, but thanks to the wonders of virtual backgrounds.
This is what's on my desk, chocolate, which I ordered like a case of chocolate because it's like, I need a coping mechanism.
I was eat those little Ritz Bits sandwich crackers, which I usually never let batches, and even still, it's like, do I want their bag? Like,
yeah,
yes, I do want
those are delicious. All right, let's see. Maybe we'll give like they're coming in a high rate, so we'll give people like 1 more minute to come on in. Oh, hey, Hamburg! Wow. Oh, that's Nicole. Hi, Nicole.
Oh, Hamburg. All these places, like, we're not going to get there for another few years.
Oh my gosh, Pakistan, amazing. Silicon Valley, Sao Paulo. Oh my goodness, Bolivia. So cool. This is great. We have no United States folks. Oh my goodness, India. Oh no, we do. There we go. Dallas, DC in the house. Rural Pennsylvania. Oh, Lauren, you froze for a second for me. Amazing. Okay.
Yeah, I might need to tell my kids to get off the internet if the connection is bad. So just let me know.
Okay. I'm going to share screen. Super. Oh yeah, to answer Suzanne's question, yes, your all's mics are muted, so you can do whatever you need to do while you listen to this. It's always refreshing to be on mute and invisible to me on Zoom meetings.
Yeah, we can't tell who's signed up unless you write something who clicks on the link.
All right, let's get started. Oh, thank you, Priya. I'll be announcing who the artist is who did this background in just a second. All right, so welcome everyone. Once again, we have a great crew for chapter 3. I'm super impressed that people are sticking around. They're coming back. So thanks for being here with us on your Friday at whatever time it is in your different locales. And today we're going to be talking about chapter 3. So first, as always, we like to do an Indigenous land acknowledgement. Even though we're all virtual these days, we're still rooted in bodies, and the bodies are standing on land. And so we like to acknowledge the Indigenous folks that are the stewards of our lands. So in exploring and writing about the imagined foundations of a society and a culture, we feel it necessary to acknowledge the very real foundation of our own. We therefore acknowledge the Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land where this event is taking place, and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land that we are on today is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation, where I am, and the Muskogee Creek people, where Lauren is. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather and perform from time immemorial. All right, so welcome to it's week 4 and chapter 3. So a couple of logistical things. As before, we have this Google Doc that folks set up for our first gathering that I think people are still using. So that is the link right there, bit.ly/datafem0417, if you want to get into that and take notes or share resources or anything like that. At Beta Live, set up a Data Feminism reading group list on Twitter. So if you want to be added, just drop him a line. One big announcement, folks have been asking about that code. We had a little bit of a discussion about the promo code last week. So for some reason, MIT's been switching their systems, and that promo code, they couldn't get it to work. The DataFem 20 can't work, and it's not going to work in the future. So the remedy to that is we're going to be able to give away 25 free copies of the book. So in particular, if you tried to use the code and it didn't work and you don't have a copy of the book, go to that link, bit.ly/datafem25. And or if you're a person who lives in a faraway place where you can't get a copy of the book, or if buying the book represents a kind of financial hardship for you, please go put your name on this list, and we will try to get copies out to everybody. So yeah, and whatever data, I mean, it should go without saying, but whatever data you give us on that form, we're not going to be like sharing it with anyone, or even we'll throw it away afterwards. And oh yeah, and a shout out to Elvia Vasconcelos, who's also goes by Sketch Notes Are Awesome on Instagram. She has been documenting all of our meetings, and we've been posting her sketch notes along with the videos. So big thanks to her, and you can go check out her work on our reading group page. And my Zoom background is by the artist Lisa Rampili. And Lawrence is by Ori Komatani, and we both have wonderful neighbors and partners taking care of our children today, so thank you to them. So we're here today to discuss chapter 3, where we're talking about the principle elevate emotion and embodiment. And this chapter, as you'll see, deals a lot with we have been talking a lot about power, and really looking at power conceived broadly and kind of like the whole data environment. So from data collection to analysis and cleaning to how data are used and like AI is used to predict things. You'll see this week we're talking a lot about data visualization, because it's that communication and interface point between data and a broader public. And the chapter has a really long title, which I think by the end of the session, hopefully you'll understand where the title comes from, but it's on rational, scientific, objective viewpoints from mythical, imaginary, impossible standpoints. And so like, if that's not unpacked by the end of this session, tell us and we'll unpack it a little bit more. But the basic principle that we're talking about today is this idea of elevating emotion and embodiment, and thinking about why those things are exiled often in data science and in data communication. Like, why do we regard emotion as suspect? Why does being a body in a particular position, why is that not looked at as a higher form of knowledge? So data feminism teaches us to value multiple forms of knowledge, including the knowledge that comes from people as living, feeling bodies in the world. And now I'll turn it over to Lauren to take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's really great to see you here. I feel like as our quarantines are extended, it's nicer and nicer to feel community and collectivity around the world. Just logistically, I'm in the process of trying to kick my kids off the internet. So please let me know if you can't hear me, and I might need to pass it back to Catherine because my internet connection, while multiple people in the house are using it, is bad. Anyway, so the two previous chapters, so last week and the week before, we were really focusing, as Catherine said, on the issue of power and people, right? Like the people who have power and the people who don't. But another major idea that comes from feminism relates to what like theorists would call like structures of power, right? So sort of more conceptual power. And more specifically, binary structures that are defined by really hard distinctions between two groups, right? So feminist theory has helped to show how these binary distinctions are usually hiding a hierarchy with one group on top and the other on the bottom. And then once you see the hierarchy, you start to understand how and why there's a hard line, or this insistence on a hard line between groups is there. The reason for that line is to ensure that one group stays on the top and the other group stays on the bottom, and there's no travel between them, right? So the distinction between the idea of like man and woman is the obvious reference point in discussions of feminism, since it's a clear example both of a false binary and also of an unequal hierarchy, right? So there's more than two genders, and among them, no gender is better than any of the others. But one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to take this critique of the gender binary and then use it to question and dismantle other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world. So you could think of the distinction between nature and culture, between subject and object, or the one that this chapter takes up, which is this artificial distinction between reason and emotion. It's interesting, like this chapter first and then the next chapter is actually about binary. Teaching this book this past semester, I was like, maybe we should have flipped the order of these two chapters. I don't know how Catherine feels, but I feel like if we were writing the book again, I might have at least put chapter 4 before chapter 3. So just keep that in mind as you're reading. And in case you want some background on this chapter, you might want to read forward. And then hopefully at the end of those two chapters, you'll understand where we're coming from. So getting back to this idea of binaries and hierarchies. So it's sort of in like this general Anglo-Western context, we've been taught traditionally that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we see this play out in data and data visualization in particular, right? So best practices for data visualization often involve like a clean design, a minimal aesthetic, sort of this idea of like just present the facts. But the question that this chapter takes is why these are practices, especially when research has shown that we interpret these aesthetic choices, and that's what they are, aesthetic choices, just as emotionally as others. We tend to believe that these minimal, clean charts are actually more truthful than they are. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the visualization research behind this. But we wanted to start out with an example that demonstrates the opposite, a visualization that deliberately leverages emotion. And that's what the example that you see here helps us explore. So, Catherine, if you could just go to the next slide for me, that would be great. Thank you. So the larger...
Just so you know that folks are reporting in the chat that your internet is breaking up a little bit. So I don't know if there's any more kids you can take off the internet.
Only got 2.
Do they each have like 3 devices?
I'm just reading group, but that means that's the trade-off, I guess, between internet and distraction. I feel like the moral of that story is you just never win. Okay. Okay, so Catherine, I don't know, do you want to take over? Because people are saying that the internet is bad for me.
Yeah, or do you want to try? It's
okay, I'll try
right
one
now.
more slide, and we'll
try
see
this slide and let's see how it goes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so the black images that you see, the big one and the small one, are actually screenshots of an animated visualization. It's by the design firm Periscopic, and actually, if you Google like periscopic U.S. gun deaths, you'll find it, and you can watch it while I'm talking. And what you are seeing a screenshot of is animated visualization of the number of gun-related deaths in the United States in 2 years, 2013 and 2010. the people killed by a gun in that year is represented by a single arc. So on the left in the small image, you see the first person who is counted. And they're traced one by one onto the screen. So they start out really slowly so you can read details about each person, but then the arcs get faster and faster until they they overlap and they create this sort of that like web semicircle. There's actually a geometric term for that shape, but I don't know it off the top of my head, that you can see in the larger image. And as you watch, like it gets overwhelming. It's to the point, or at least for me, it becomes almost unbearable because you think it's done because it's become almost opaque, but it just keeps on going for minutes and minutes more. And that's kind of the point, right? Like there are too many people being killed by guns in the United States. It sort of animates the idea
Lauren, we might have lost you.
that are employed are determined using a sophisticated statistical model. I think they use projections from the World Health Organization. But this was never, and you can actually read about this. They have a detailed methods page, which I always show my students when I teach it. It nevertheless viewed with a lot of suspicion from the visualization community because it has film. The question I want to begin with in this chapter is, why is that a problem? You know, why should we view a visualization that makes us feel things with suspicion? So at this point, I will turn it over to Catherine and I will troubleshoot my internet while this is happening.
Cool. So sort of like the question is why did folks think like, oh, is this okay? Like, is it okay to have a data visualization like the periscopic gun deaths one, where the foremost emotion that comes forward from that piece is the emotion of loss and grief, because we're seeing individual people's names along with the years that they have lost. And you know, one of the reasons people reacted like that, like, we're not sure this is okay, is because the received wisdom in visualization communications is that visualization should be as plain as possible, as minimal as possible, with as neutral titles as possible, a kind of just the facts, ma'am approach to visual style. We see this in things like Edward Tufte. So he proposed this thing called the data ink ratio, which basically said we shouldn't waste any ink on stuff that's not data, like illustration, imagery that doesn't relate to the data at hand, like that, you know, that has no place. And we also see this in workshop materials from The Guardian, like this one, where in one of their data workshops, they called a spreadsheet clarity without persuasion. So they're sort of saying like a spreadsheet is this great way to communicate because you're not persuading anybody of anything, and so on. But throughout the chapter 3, we challenge this idea of neutral and minimal data visualization being better somehow. And then we ask 2 questions. First of all, if we do visual minimalism, meaning the just the facts, ma'am, the neutral approach, is it really more neutral? Like, is that true? And then secondly, how might activating emotion, instead of exiling it, if we actually like think about emotion as being a tool in our toolbox, how does that help us work with and communicate with data? And so one of our main arguments is that there's a rhetorical element in every kind of presentation of data. And when we say rhetorical element, that just means there's editorial choices that designers have made about what to keep in and what to leave out, right? So we're always making choices, and any kind of data visualization or data communication is exactly the same. And one example that we cite in the book, this comes from Jonathan Stray's book, The Curious Journalist's Guide to Data, which is a beautiful, pragmatic, but also like kind of philosophical book I encourage folks to read. So he puts this New York Times piece up. And there's a great piece, it's from 2012, where the September 2012 jobs report came out. And the New York Times said, okay, there's like, here's two ways of making a visualization about this. On the one hand, on the left, you see that the Democrats, so they made like a Democrats version, and the Democrats were in office at the time. This was Barack Obama. And so the Democrats might frame the jobs report really positively, and there they are saying that unemployment is falling, and it's falling larger than we expected it to fall. But then on the right, the Republican version of the chart highlights that the unemployment rate was higher than what we would desire for a very long period of time. So it's critical of the current administration. And it's important to note that both of these charts are true. None of them they're not presenting false information. They're not trying to mislead people even. But in each of these cases, the folks designing them chose different aspects to emphasize. And you can notice that the title, which folks have shown plays a really important role in what people take away from a data visualization. The title also plays a really big job in sort of framing what we see. So the rate has fallen more than 2 points since its recent peak versus the rate was above 8% for 43 months. And so what Stray says is this constraints of truth leave a very wide space for interpretation. So the point here is that there are just always editorial choices present in every data communication that we do. It's always going to be there. It doesn't have to be as partisan as Republicans versus Democrats, but it's always there. We are always choosing and selecting certain things and framing things over other things. So rather than striving for a kind of false objectivity or neutrality, what we can strive to do instead is to own up to and take responsibility for our choices. And this is especially true, especially right now, when we think about how communicating with data is pretty high stakes, in particular during coronavirus times, where we're seeing data visualizations are kind of everywhere right now. Because the thing is, people believe data visualizations. Data visualizations look precise, they look neutral, they look objective, they look true. And this is definitely the case. The sociology researchers have actually shown exactly this, sort of inquiring into like, why do visualizations have this aura of objectivity? And where they landed, they focused on the visual conventions of visualizations, things like two-dimensional viewpoint, so kind of flatness, clean layouts, geometric shapes and lines. So things like sort of very clean lines, sort of looking like they're mechanically produced rather than produced by somebody's hand, right? Which would give more of a sort of subjective position into the visual. And then the inclusion of data sources at the bottom of the data visualization. So these four conventions, they have shown work to support this aura of objectivity. And then feminist philosopher Donna Haraway actually has a name for that aura of objectivity, and it's called the God trick. And so this is a phrase that she uses to describe what she says as seeing everything from nowhere, this like sort of false impression that we could see everything from the standpoint of no person. And so when you think about it, this view from nowhere is like this God's eye view. It's from above, and it's maybe the most signature feature of communicating with data. That's typically how we see with like maps and the network visualizations we're just showing, line charts and graphs and things like that. And so it also masks, though, the messiness that's behind the surface, the way the person wrangled the data, the editorial choices they made. It all looks kind of perfect at the end of the line. And so Haraway describes this as a trick because it makes the viewer believe that they can see everything all at the same time from this very imaginary and impossible position, right? They're not the God's eye view, but they're kind of placed in that position of being the God's eye view. And it's also a trick because it's what appears to be neutral is actually always a partial perspective. And often when we are looking at and valorizing neutrality, what we're valorizing is the perspective of who's on top, the dominant default group. So if you could, hopefully you all were in last week's reading group. So if you think back, we showed a redlining map. If you remember the map of Detroit, where all of Detroit's Black neighborhoods fell in areas that were marked with red on the map. And that was, in a way, this quintessential version of this God trick in action. Because that map seems objective. It's of a large geographic area. It's super precise. It was using very advanced technological cartographic methods of its time. You don't see any people in the image. The lines are clean and mechanical. But it was designed, as we talked about, it was designed by people with very specific intentions. So like the Detroit Chamber of Commerce, all elite white guys. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, mostly elite white guys. But you don't see them. Nowhere is their presence or their positionality or their subjectivity visible in the map. It's neutral, supposedly, right? It's a really good example of the God trick at work. And so I'm going to turn this to Lauren to say more about God trick.
Okay, I'm super excited about this example because it has to do with outer space, which is my favorite thing. This is actually like one of my favorite examples of the God trick, and also of Haraway's related concept of something called situated knowledges, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. And this image, on first glance, it would seem to be showing us another one of these everything from nowhere views, right? Or at least it's like a view from the most nowhere-like perspective that we as humans can achieve, which is like somewhere out there in outer space. But there's a totally fascinating story about this particular image, right? So this is actually called the Blue Marble. It's the first it's the first photograph taken of the Earth from outer space. It was taken aboard the Apollo 17 spacecraft as it was orbiting Earth, gathering up speed before it rocketed itself to the moon. And it was actually like an illegal shot. Because of the weight constraints of the spacecraft, literally every single camera shot, every single exposure of film on the spacecraft was planned in advance. But this particular one wasn't in like the photo plan. And there's actually a dispute between two of the astronauts on board as to who took it, because they actually can't remember which one did. But the story, there's like a ton more to say, but I'm really trying to end us on time. That gets really, the story of the photo gets even more interesting because it was actually the lab tech back at the NASA photo lab who, when he was developing the roll of film from the flight, so like saw the image come into focus in the pool of like Fixer or whatever, if you think back, if you ever took like a high school photo lab class. And he was, as the story goes, like he pulled it out of the chemicals as it was being developed and ran down the hall to the communications team and said like, oh my God, this is the image for you. And at that point, the comms team was like, oh, of course, we don't need any of those like blurry moonshots. This is the one we want to show. And it was distributed to the press. And at that time, it became the most circulated image in the world. And it was really the lab tech who was the one who picked it. And then you can sort of layer in on top of those issues of like labor and hierarchy, everything we know about the space race, right? And the intersection of US cultural and political hegemony. And then you can add in what we know about like the hidden figures women, including Christine Darden, who we talked about in the intro lecture. And you get the dimensions of gender and race. And again, like I can send you references on this. It's a great story and there's a ton more to say. But I wanted to bring this up because it's a way of illustrating, on the one hand, the illusion of the view from nowhere, right? Like this is clearly a view from somewhere. It's from the Apollo 11 spacecraft. It's from like literally one man, an astronaut, taking a picture with his camera. And then on the other, the real reality of what Haraway calls situated knowledges. And by this, she means that all knowledge is rooted in a particular place at a particular time within a particular set of personal, cultural, social, and political conditions.
Yeah, exactly. And so here's how she explains it in her book called Situated Knowledges. So situated knowledges are about communities, not about isolated individuals. The only way to find a larger vision is to be somewhere in particular. The science question in feminism is about objectivity as positioned rationality, by which she means we're cited in bodies. Like we are here in these bodies and we have to acknowledge that this is where we come from. We have particular worldviews and experiences and so on. Its images are not the products of escape and transcendence of limits, the view from above, that God trick, but the joining of partial views and halting voices into a collective subject position that promises a vision of the means of ongoing finite embodiment. of living within limits and contradictions of views from somewhere. And so this joining of partial views, we actually picked this up again in chapter 5, where we're talking about this principle of embracing pluralism, sort of thinking about like the feminist way to producing a more robust knowledge, to getting closer to what this ideal of objectivity might look like, would be from bringing together all of these multiple and partial perspectives. And so Haraway calls that feminist objectivity, and that's her answer to the God trick. And note that her answer is not relativism. It's not like, oh, everyone has an opinion and they're all equal. That's not how it works. So the idea is we bring as many partial perspectives together as we can, and we have more knowledge and more complete knowledge, like the context surrounding the image of the Earth from space.
Okay, so very briefly, this is actually a project of mine where we tried to get at this idea of situated knowledges. There was this children's educator from the 19th century, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. Actually, she was also like an editor and did a lot of an intellectual really, and did a lot of other stuff. But this relates to her ideas about education. And she looked around herself at the dawning of the Civil War. So this project dates to the 1850s. And she recognized that her generation had just done like a truly lousy job of figuring out how to address issues, you know, like slavery and how to end it, or the nation threatening to split apart. And so she seized upon essentially large-scale visualization as a strategy that might allow her students to generate their own ideas about both the past and the future. So what you see in the back is actually a visualization of significant events in history. And this image is small, but she actually created these floor-sized versions of these charts. And she intended to have students sit around it and sort of contemplate with their full bodies the colors and the shapes that they perceived. It was also deliberately abstract because she wanted each student to come up with their own narrative about how the events fit together. And the idea, again, was that by having each student be prompted to sort of create meaning and connections for themselves, they would generate multiple possibilities that could be then sort of joined together into a more robust view. And then in the front, what you see is a project from the Digital Humanities Lab that I run, where we tried to really like inhabit the ideas from Peabody's charts and sort of extend them for today. And working with the students you see named up in the top left, we are almost done with actually creating this large-scale touch interface so that you can act not just sort of by sitting around, but also touching and pressing and altering the data in real time with your whole body. And so there's just one more project that I wanted to mention here. This is a project that takes this idea of embodied knowledge to a whole other level. And it's actually also my favorite footnote from the chapter. And it's only a footnote because the project was documented and brought to international attention after we turned in the manuscript for the book. So we could add a footnote, but not a new section of the chapter. It's a project by Data Zetu in Tanzania. They ran a design competition for creating fabrics with statistics about gender-based violence embedded in the patterns, and then they held a fashion show with the winning designs. And so here again, we have this example of embracing the whole human body, the social context, also the joy of coming together around a common justice-oriented mission, and it's all embodied in this act of data communication. And so now I'll pass it back to Catherine to talk a little bit more about that.
So yeah, so Lauren's floor chart and the Data Z2 project are great examples of this idea that we talk about a little bit more in the chapter called data visceralization. And so this is a concept from the artist Kelly Dobson. And thinking about data visceralization means thinking about not only how we make things for the eyes to consume, but visceralizations are representations of data that the whole body can experience, both emotionally as well as physically. So it's data that we see or hear or feel or breathe or even ingest in some way. And so like in Data Z2, the people wore the data, like they literally had it on their bodies. In Lauren's project, people orient their bodies around the large scale object, they touch and activate the data and have a kind of interactive aspect. And so we have a number of examples of data visceralization in the book. Many of those come out of art and design, where folks are really thinking very expansively about data communication. But we also want to stress that even the most humble sort of bar chart can start to think about ways to make your message visceral. So thinking about how to incorporate emotion and embodiment into how the chart or the graphic addresses the viewer. And so this leads to my favorite footnote. And so in this footnote, we summarize some of the recent scientific research that supports this idea of integrating emotion, novelty, embellishment, illustration into two-dimensional visualizations. And so, for example, this 2010 study by Scott Bateman and colleagues, they found that embellished bar charts, so like bar charts, they have a great example of a bar chart in the form of a monster. They do not hinder people's ability to accurately read them. And in fact, they make them more easy to remember in terms of what was the subject of the data. And so people also thought these junk charts, what Tufte would call a junk chart, decorated with monsters, were more attractive and enjoyed them more. And so we have to say, like, duh, like, who doesn't like monsters better than bar charts, you know? Seems very logical, right? But they proved it. So likewise, in 2016, Michelle Borkin and her colleagues showed that visualizations that make use of novel presentation techniques are more memorable. So this idea of relating the visual form of the visualization to the topical content can really work along all of these different kind of measures of success. And then we end with a quote from data journalist Mona Chalabi, who she says, "If it's about farts, draw a butt, for God's sakes." And so she, if you haven't seen her work, we would encourage you to go check it out. She does these amazing infographics, hand illustrated charts, and a variety of different things. Okay. So following Haraway, one of these main critiques, a feminist critique of sort of regular data visualization, is that it operates as this God trick. So presenting this false idea that we can see everything from no actual position, grounded in no actual body. And so you might be thinking, well, Lauren and Catherine are saying we should never use the God trick. That's just verboten, we should not do that. But the answer to that is actually no, that is actually not what they're saying, or what we're saying. Because if there's any rule in design, it's that context matters almost more than everything else, more than sort of exiling certain techniques. And so in fact, a God trick can be very, very useful. So a design choice made in one context doesn't always translate to other contexts and audiences. So basically we just say, never say never in design. What you want in design is to have more choices, not less choices in your toolbox. And this is you, Lauren.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so I just wanted to say very briefly, so one of the really interesting things that happened during the peer review process, I think most of you know this, but if you don't, so we put a draft of this book online for open peer review, and then we invited people who we really respected to offer their comments on certain parts of it, in addition to just sort of like opening it up for everyone to leave their thoughts. And one of the people we asked for comments on essentially like everything up to the slide that Catherine just got to was Fernanda Viegas, who is an amazing visualization designer. She works at Google. She has a long history of doing, I'm sure you've seen her visualizations without even knowing that they were hers, but like she was early in the space, has huge reach. And she read our argument sort of up to that point and actually said, sort of, I disagree. I think you're coming down too hard on the God trick. And actually, she said, you can see her quote, "The kind of overview that data visualization provides is one of the superpowers that I treasure most." And we ended up incorporating that quote into the final version of the book because we thought it just spoke really to this idea that we've been talking about thus far about the sort of the intentionality of deploying any of these techniques, right? It is really empowering to be able to provide that, that sort of view from nowhere, but you need to be aware that you're doing it and you need to be choosing it for the right reasons. And then I'm just gonna pass back to Catherine. We're gonna end on time for one last example.
Yay. And so in order to support this idea of like, don't never do a God trick, we bring up the example from Margaret Pierce. So she's a cartographer. She's also a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And she spent 15 months collecting Indigenous place names from First Nations groups, Métis, and Inuit peoples in Canada, or what is currently Canada. And then together with the Canadian American Centre in Maine, published this map called Coming Home to Indigenous Place Names in Canada. So it's a map of what we now, many of us today call Canada, but it's with only Indigenous place names and with no Toronto, Ottawa, so on. And so here, this is the quintessential sort of God trick, right? We're seeing like a large amount of geographic territory from above, a large amount of space, very authoritative. And in fact, this is by design. So she actually designed the map at the same size and the same scale and the same projection as the official National Resources Canada map, the kind of official map making body in Canada. But in this case, she's sort of like using the God's eye view to challenge the colonizer's view of this land, right? So kind of like using it to advocate, like using the authority, that aura that it connotes, to re-see this land under very different terms of engagement, and also to assert Indigenous sovereignty and to respect Indigenous homelands. So we really sort of love this use of the God trick. And then at the same time, Margaret has written a paper about this, which we're referencing here. It's coming out this year in Cartographica, who's doing a special issue on decolonizing the map. But she's very transparent in her essay about how the map doesn't reveal everything also. And so to make the map, she followed traditional Indigenous methodologies of respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. Which meant understanding and respecting how and when Indigenous folks wanted to share their names, which she and they considered cultural property. She's actually very definitive that she doesn't consider these data, these are cultural property. And understanding how and when folks wanted to share and when they wanted to obscure. And so in this case, the use of the God trick actually has protective effects. Because it's generalized, it's very high level. Any single point on the map, corresponds to miles and miles of territory on the ground, meaning that it obscures the exact geographic location of each point on this map that's being shared with outsiders, people who are outside to the Indigenous cultures. And so, as we say in the book, the God trick here actually communicates Indigenous authority while preserving Indigenous autonomy. And so you can read more about this in her essay. And then we put all of the permissions here as well, because every time the map is reproduced, Margaret checks in with everybody whose names are going to be legible to make sure that they're okay with that use in that context. And so you can just see that, like, just reproducing this particular image in the book meant checking in with 6 sort of entities, but often that's many, many more than 6 people. So it's like a kind of really interesting way of proceeding with respect. And then more.
Yeah, so that's essentially it for the contents of the talk today. There's a lot more in the book. We were very good about, we cut out a whole bunch of slides, so I'm patting ourselves on the back. We did that, depending on time. But there's a lot more. You should definitely read the chapter. But just to summarize, so embracing emotion and embodiment, always look out for the God trick. Instead of striving for neutrality or objectivity, you should strive for accessibility and responsibility. Valuing emotion, that's really important. So these include the emotions of delight, of surprise, of grief, and of anger. And these are all fundamental ways that humans learn and engage in the world. When you sort of adhere to this principle, it means designing for whole bodies and experience, right? We're not just like eyeballs attached to stalks and brains, but living, feeling, sensing bodies. And then also avoiding sort of universal design rules. So this idea that context is queen, that you should always look to the environments, the people and the context in which your design will be circulated in order to influence your design decisions. Okay. And I guess I should just say, like, not universal design as in like designing for accessibility, not that type of universal design. Universal meaning like meaning a one-size-fits-all approach. Point of clarification. Okay, yeah, we just wanted to end, as we usually do, with a couple of feminist shout outs. I will, okay, so let's see. There's Turn and Flow is looking for some crowdfunding. This is technology to recycle organic pads and tampons. The Turn and Flow system will make used menstrual care products into a source of energy and natural fertilizer. They're raising money for a lab trial with Cranfield University in the UK, and that's a link to their page. Fempower.tech is a collective that raises awareness of feminist issues in HCI by being overtly critical and political. I'm always here for that. Raising voices of underrepresented groups, presenting tangible outcomes, and doing activism. So you can check out their website at fempower.tech. And then finally, this is a personal plea. Help our students. A bunch of my students, and Catherine actually has said this has happened to a couple of her students too, have had their summer internships canceled at the last minute due to the coronavirus, either because they can't travel anymore, or the organizations themselves are no longer operational or can't support students at this time. So if you have interesting work for students with good data analysis and statistical analysis skills, mostly in R, but they're flexible. My students also have great writing skills. Please get in touch, we'd really appreciate it. And we'd love to share any opportunities, could be small, could be large, with our students who are at home with their families, looking for a way to make a difference this summer. Okay, I think, oh, sorry.
Lauren, there's a quick question in the chat. What's the email? Can you just quickly say your email to get in touch?
Oh, sure. It's lauren.klein@emory.edu. lauren.klein@emory.edu. I just typed it there. Or you can find me on Twitter. That also works.
Great. So we have time for questions, yay. So let's see, one question that's been really upvoted is from Beatrice Diaz, and it's how do you grapple with the way that emotions have been used, particularly by right-leaning groups, to undermine facts, data, and reasoning? So I'm going to let Lauren take the lead on that.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Catherine. Appreciate that.
Or if you want, I can jump in.
No, I mean, I feel, in a way, I feel like it's, it's what we've been saying, right? And it speaks to sort of, I think, Fernanda Viegas's point, which is like, all of these things, including emotions, are powerful tools, and they expose the situatedness of all information design, right? And I think the most we can do, and unfortunately, this is just, there's like, you just need to constantly be the resistance, be like, this is coming from somewhere. These reflect the choices made by the designers to present the data in this way. And I think actually we have seen, there have been a couple of high profile cases where there has been like a very misleading or deliberately fear-mongery graphic, and enough people with big enough soapboxes have called those out that we have seen that sort of pushback get more traction. But I think it's, and Catherine, I'll be curious to know if you just agree with me, but I think it's one of these things where you can't tire of it. You sort of need to view your role as to always be there, to be the one who says something and just not let it pass.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love this question because, even just since we've been writing the book, we've seen the rise of the sort of really kind of, alt-right, white supremacist, the current president of the US, who's a very savvy and super intelligent in this one aspect, which is around emotions and sort of norms and boundaries crossing, and knowing what emotions that will provoke in people and what kind of response that will get, and in addition, like what kind of attention that will kind of like shine back on him. And so I totally agree that emotion is a key sort of strategy that's being used by right-wing governments, kind of, you know, we can look at also at Brazil and Bolsonaro, things like this. I think they're really leveraging emotion. But to me, that doesn't mean that like emotion in itself isn't inherently good or bad. Like just because they're doing that doesn't mean they're feminist, for example. What I think is wrong is where we exile emotion and say, well, and we kind of become very binaristic about it. We say, well, if right-wing people are using emotion, then like what we need to do is to exile emotion and just like be super boring and be like the neutral and objective perspective. And there's something really false about that as well. And I also think there's a fine line between being responsible, right? Like think about like what does it mean to be responsible and accountable to the interpretation that you're creating, knowing that as a designer you have a responsibility to creating that interpretation and responsibility to your audience, and propaganda. And I do think those are like two pretty different things as well that have to do with intentionality. Otherwise we collapse again into that position of relativism of like, well, it's using emotion, so it's good. So yeah, but I think it's a great question because I think it's one of the things that the rise of emotion and emotionally driven ways of agitating people and pushing propaganda on folks is super troubling, and I am particularly troubled by it, even as like we advocate in the book for kind of introducing emotion back in. So thank you for that. Lauren,
Okay,
do you want to take one?
Okay, so the next question, it says, this is from Lana Gorlinsky, and they say, my concern is embracing subjectivity leads to a form of data nihilism that I've noticed among certain political factions that think that since all data is interpreted subjectively, this grants license to choose that which supports their view, i.e. the phrase lies, damn lies and statistics. How do we embrace subjectivity and emotion without complete relativism, or make sure these partial perspectives are all presented and accounted for? So that's another great question. And this is, it's sort of related to, I think, what Catherine was already saying. But for me, the really key thing for me is to emphasize, and I think I say this like in almost every single time I talk about this, is that being aware of the partial nature of the perspective that the data offers actually leads to better and more accurate data science, right? And like we can think about like COVID data, right? So if we say actually like the data of these number of cases in different countries is contextualized by the degree to which those countries enable testing, right? Like in South Korea, they're doing tons of testing. In the US, still not enough. That actually allows us to interpret the data with more meaning, right? By acknowledging the fact that the data comes from these localized or sort of countrywide contexts, or even in the United States subdivided, like we've seen now in the past week, how people are calling attention to the importance of disaggregating the number of new cases because New York is falling so much that it's counterbalancing the rise pretty much everywhere else in the country. So to me, the important thing is to emphasize how more context actually leads to more, better, more accurate knowledge, and not the way around. And just to keep on saying that and keep on giving examples. And ultimately, like that's what people should want. They should want to make sure that they're getting the context for the data so that they're not leading to false conclusions. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Catherine.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and yeah, I see it as being somewhat similar to the last question, but again, I think the position of like a person like Haraway with this idea of feminist objectivity, again, would not be about like, oh, each individual has their opinion and like that's okay and it's all equally true or something like that. It would be more saying we come together and we pool these different standpoints from different lived experiences in different bodies, and together, like it's sort of like we build a kind of consensus view of truth, and then like the important thing is remembering to include those perspectives which have been traditionally marginalized because of the matrix of domination. So I think like it is still like there's a collective process of coming to terms with what the truth is, could be, and should be. And it's not up to one individual to decide that, and it's not up to one like political party to decide that. The next question is actually somewhat similar, so I think maybe we should go down. Let's see. Sorry, we're just
Catherine, you should do this question from Erin, because I feel like you'll have a lot to say about this.
Okay, in this chapter, if it posits that many dataviz theorists and practitioners have come from disciplines aligned with engineering and CS, does this argue for the ability for data feminism to be in conjunction with other studies, data science versus its own separate course, data ethics? Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah, so thinking about like, do we, if we are going to teach about these things, do we teach about these things in relation, like embedded? I read the question as being, do we teach about these things as being embedded in data science or computer science courses, or in their own separate courses, like on data ethics? Okay. Hopefully that's right, Erin. Hopefully I'm interpreting that question right. Yeah, I mean, I think I would always advocate for doing, like, never separating ethics out from the other things. Like, it's sort of wonderful. And there's this great spreadsheet that Casey Feisler has been collecting for now, I think, actually 4 years. And it's all the ethics courses that are currently being taught in different programs, at least in the US. I'm not sure if it's internationally as well. So on the one hand, I'm really heartened by that, like the fact that we are talking more about data ethics and there are these courses that are popping up. On the other hand, I think it's going to be really hard for folks to, like learners, to draw the connections between what data ethics actually means in situ if their professors can't model that for them in their classes, right? And so like my thought would be that we have to be doing sort of both at the same time. It doesn't have to be all the time. Like, you know, sometimes in basic programming classes, you just need to talk about like some algorithm or what's a variable or something like that. But giving examples where these kinds of questions come into play and posing these kinds of problems that then could be maybe picked up and deepened in a kind of focused ethics class. So, I mean, my position would always be to try to weave through the curriculum to help folks connect what happens in an ethics class to what happens in their life, you know, and in their work. I don't know if Lauren, you want to say more?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that there are these two fields, related fields of engineering education and CS education. They're real research fields. And one of the big questions right now is how you teach CS ethics or engineering ethics, or in like data science is still, I think, sort of inchoate enough that we don't really have as many established subfields, but there's real research that has been done on this, and the consensus is that this integrated approach is so much better than like the one ethics requirement course. And Casey Feisler is a good starting point for that, but there's a whole field out there if you want to read about this. The other thing I'll say though, that the one, and I love teaching the classes that are very syncretic, like that's what I love to do. But I do feel like the one thing you need to be aware of, or not you, but like needs to be aware of, is that there is expertise coming from both of these fields that you sort of don't always have the time to do if you're always doing these syncretic classes. And this is a real challenge just in education more generally, like how you blend different fields, how you blend theory and practice. And it always, I think, involves taking some courses that are, you know, a deep dive into one or the other, and other courses that model the synthesis. And I think ultimately, and I've now seen this because I've been a part of a couple of interdisciplinary programs over the years, what it really takes is like a coherent curriculum. So not just at the level of individual courses, but also establishing like, this is the trajectory, this is how we want students or learners to sort of move through so that they're exposed to each of these things, and do so in a way that, I mean, the danger is like, you know, ethics and coming out of either philosophy or the humanities, like there are people who just focus on that alone, and that research is much deeper and more nuanced and sort of has a longer history than if you just show up and you say like, here are some roles and you're a data justice class, right? So I think the importance is to, like, it's a really fine line to walk, but I think you also need to be attentive to the places where you can say to either as a student being like, I think I'm only just like, this is the tip of the iceberg. Or as the teacher saying, if you're interested in this, go cross-register in this class in this other department, or go read this book, or go take a look at this field, because there's always more.
Lauren, just one follow-up to that Erin posted in the chat, which I feel like you could speak to really well, is she's saying even how these other disciplines like the humanities maybe need to teach ethics and justice with a technical framework, like building in technology knowledge as well. And I actually feel like your lab does that.
Yeah, so there's this field, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's called digital humanities. There's a really good book series. I don't know who edits it. It's called Debates in the Digital Humanities. No. Yeah, no, there's a field called Digital Humanities, which does exactly this. It's 1 p.m. So I do want to and on time, but this is, you know, over the past 10, 15, 20 years, bringing digital issues and technical issues hand in hand with issues of ethics and justice and context in terms of history, culture, sort of theory more generally. This is, I think, one of the major innovations of the humanities in the past bunches of years. And so if you're interested, you can like email me and I'll give you a whole reading list.
Just quickly say the book series. Someone's asking, what's the name of the book series?
Oh, it's called Debates in the Digital Humanities. It's online, it's open access. It's published by the University of Minnesota Press, but it's hosted on the CUNY, go CUNY, the CUNY website, and someone pasted the link right there, so you can find it.
Awesome. All right, that concludes chapter 3. Thank you to everybody for coming and joining us again. And yeah, if you want us to give you a shout out next week during the Feminist shout out, get in touch on Twitter, and we will see you all next week. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.